if there are things that the family doesn't talk about, the children somehow know anyway, and they go ahead and act it out. Whereas if the family is open about the family skeleton, Uncle Robert, who's the alcoholic, that kind of thing, then they don't. And without getting too pop psychology here, I could see where I had problems in relationships that almost exactly mirrored the stuff that Dad told me about. How do you deal with the lack of certainty? How do you deal with that? And our response has been, nobody knows really what's going to happen with their kids. We live with the illusion of predictability and certainty. We think we know what's going to happen. And so we have been literally disillusioned. I don't know that comfortable is the right word for it, but we've gotten used to the idea of make your plans, but hold them lightly because they're going to change.
This episode of the Kintsugi Podcast is brought to you by Pause, Breathe, Reflect, which can help you bring mindfulness to your everyday moments. Hey there, my fellow like-hearted humans. It's Michael, and this is the Kintsugi Podcast. I can't wait to share this week's story of connection with you. It's with another like-hearted human. He's curious, he's a partner, a dad, a speaker, a writer, but most importantly, he's putting a beautiful ripple into the world that helps others connect with their purpose through the art of storytelling. So if you're ready, settle into a comfortable position. Let's take a healthy breath in and a slow releasing breath out. And get ready to meet Donn King. Donn, how are you?
Doing well, Michael. Thank you. Good to see you today.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining. And so I'm going to go back to that how are you question, because often as we develop connection, that question is often served up and we blow past it. So I'll ask it again. Today, how are you for reals?
Yeah. How are you really? Yeah.
Yes.
So we'll probe that in the conversation. For me, this is a good day. I had a birthday yesterday.
Well, happy birthday, belatedly.
Thank you. Celebrating another trip around the planet. Around the sun. I guess I'm going around the planet, or the planet's going around.
You're going around something, like planets, suns. But yeah, happy birthday. That's awesome.
Indeed, indeed. In the middle of editing what was intended to be the third book in a series. It's going to wind up getting released sooner, so it'll be the second one published. But it's a work of passion, and this is weird, Michael. As I'm going through it, it's been long enough since I wrote it. I'm reading it and tweaking it, and it's making me cry.
Oh, wow.
There's places in there that are really touching my heart, and that's kind of cool.
Is it bringing up emotions of happiness, sadness, or something different? Because we can cry for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. The closest I can come in language, I think, is, Susan Cain has a book out fairly recently entitled Bittersweet.
Yes, a great book.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the best label that I could put on the feelings. It surprises me sometimes. I don't know. I've reached an age where I'm getting more emotional as I get older. Sometimes I'll be watching a commercial on TV. It'll be some commercial for a belt sander or something, and it'll make me emotional.
Well, if I follow your path, Donn, like, I'm going to go through a lot of tissue because I'm already a pretty quick crier. Like, I was watching over Christmas or on Christmas, we went to go see the movie Boys in the Boat, a new release. And man, I was weeping through that whole thing. Like, I'll cry in a movie like that, or a movie like Love Actually, or Breaking Away, or what have you. Or I haven't yet cried at a dust sander or power tools, but you know what? I am open to the possibility. So it sounds like there's a lot happening. You have a birthday to celebrate. You're getting into your third book, which will be your second book, which we'll get into too as we go a little bit deeper into our conversation and really talk about your writing and connection in our Kintsugi spirit. So another question I always love to ask when we begin is about sharing something that's good that's already happened to you today before we sat down for this interview. So we're going to assume that this is a good thing, this interview. But before we sat down, is there something good that's already happened for you today?
Interestingly enough, usually the way my day goes, there would not have been opportunity. I'm more of a night owl. And so we're recording this about 11 o'clock in the morning, my time. But I had a friend that I've only known virtually who was in town visiting family, and he said, let's get together early. And so we got up this morning and went to a coffee shop 7:30 a.m., which is ungodly early for me. And we had a great visit. He's from Texas. For folks listening, I live in the East Tennessee area, so he's not over here very often. And it was just a great conversation. He's another writer, and we didn't really talk about writing all that much. It was just about connecting, talking about family and different things going on there. So that was really good. Got some good coffee. Coffee has become sort of a support for me. I know folks are not seeing this, but like my wife got me this coffee mug for a birthday.
Oh, yes, I like it. Yeah.
I came, I saw,
I forgot what I was doing, went back, got distracted, and have no idea what's going on. Is this my cup? I have to pee. Oh, yes. We haven't all, but many of us have reached that age where one question we sit with is, where's the restroom? And so, so I love it. I love it. So since this is a show about connection, one thing my wife and I love to hear are couple origin connection stories. So how did you meet your wife?
Okay. Let's think back. We met in 1994, so it's been about 30 years since we met.
30 years. That's good. Yeah.
If folks can remember that far back, it was before the internet as we know it now, but she and I were both part of an online community. Some folks who've been around for a while will know America Online. They will know CompuServe. This was a lesser-known community that was called Genie. It was owned by GE. And they were organized around roundtables, so there was a science fiction roundtable, and so Janet and I were both members of the parenting roundtable. So we just got to chatting there. It was all text only back then. There wasn't a graphic user interface. Got to know each other, found out that we lived, I think it was about an hour and a half drive apart from each other. So after a while, we decided to get on the telephone. So we talked on the phone for a while. She sent me a picture after a bit. Didn't tell me a whole lot because it's one of those glamour shots.
The glamour shots at the mall, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, not exactly truth in advertising, but whatever.
That's okay.
And eventually we got together for coffee. So we fell in love with each other before we ever met in person. There's an interesting aspect to this. One of the things that I do, among other things, I pastor a church, and I was working in a different denomination back then. But we had friends from that same community who also met online, who asked me to conduct a wedding ceremony for them. And when we got there, this wasn't planned, but there were 80 couples there, and every single one of them had met online in similar circumstances. So it's interesting to me as we're talking about connection, Michael, that, Jan and I have both said several times if we'd met in a stereotypical situation, see each other first, form those immediate impressions, those jumping to conclusions, judgments, we probably would never have even struck up a conversation.
Wow.
And so we fell in love with each other's minds and hearts and souls first. And then the voice came along and that added a dimension so that when the in-person, the visual came along, it added rather than, being the source of judgment. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I love it. And that's like two examples of meeting someone online, your other writer friend. That would have probably been, I imagine, through Zoom, but just like this whole like internet connection, and now you meet in person. So the way I met my wife was through a personal ad. So this is 1992. So I know of what you speak around AOL and Genie and all that stuff, and the 286 dial-up and that special sound it made.
Yeah.
But here we were, I put an ad in the personal section of the Washington City paper, and we had 3 hours of conversation before we even saw each other. So, our girls who are in their early 20s, they're familiar with the dating apps where there's always a photo. And they're like, wait a second. And this goes back a number of years. They're like, you didn't know what mom looked like before you went out with her? And I go, no, it's, in essence, it was hey, they call it a blind date for a reason. And now you have your photo everywhere so people can check you out. And to your point, people check out how you look now before you really get to know each other. And I think there's so many misconnections because we either consciously or subconsciously judge what we see, and we never give the relationship a chance. So yeah, I love that story. It's pretty cool. So
absolutely,
you've known your wife about as long as I've known my wife. So come May of 2024, we'll be married 30 years.
Wow.
So off of one little personal ad. So
yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So let's get into your story a little bit deeper. So if you put what you do professionally off to the side, because you do a few things. You're a professor, a pastor, a writer, a speaker. So let's just put that on the back burner of our stove. With that said, how would you describe yourself, Donn?
You mean like today?
Yeah, today. How would you describe yourself? Because it could change tomorrow, but like right now in this moment, how would you describe yourself?
And I'll be honest here, because I listened to your podcast, I knew this
question was coming. Yes.
Question would come along, and
you did your homework. That's pretty cool.
And I don't remember who it was. I remember one of your guests said the answer is I am.
Oh yeah.
And that really struck me,
It struck a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah. I had to be honest, I wouldn't have thought of that one on my own, but although yes, I'm a pastor, I also consider myself a student of truth in whatever form it takes. And so I'm familiar with the Dharma ideas of, we're not a thing, we're a relationship. And so I thought, okay, my honest answer is probably I am a learner. I'm a student. I don't mean in the formal sense. I did some thinking recently about what my primary values might be. And one of those values is curiosity. So I love digging into stuff. Before we started recording, I mentioned I had a background in journalism. Honestly, when I went to college, I chose journalism as a major because it was the closest I could get to not declaring a major.
Oh, how about that? That's pretty funny.
Yeah, journalists by nature, what they do, at least when they're doing their jobs, don't get me started, by the nature of what they do, have an excuse to poke their nose into all aspects of human experience. And that's what I was interested in. So to be able to make a living at that, that was kind of a plus. So I will say over the years, I fell into a pattern of, okay, if I'm not getting paid for this, I'm not doing it. And that was running counter to my values. Curiosity is a value in and of itself. And as I've gotten older and a little more financially secure, I don't stop and ask what's the return on investment. If I'm curious about it, I just want to dig into it.
I like that. I like the curiosity. Be curious, not judgmental, as the great Walt Whitman has been noted as saying. So you mentioned Tennessee. So bring us back. Were you always a curious kid? Share with us a little bit of your childhood, your background that brought us to today.
Indeed. I'll it reminds me of something my dad said once when I was in school struggling with a history test. He said, I had a lot easier when I was in school, son. There wasn't nearly so much history.
Yeah, as we get older, this question of like, tell me about yourself gets longer and more complicated.
Yes. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but for quick context, I grew up in West Tennessee. If people know anything about the state, it's like 3 states in one, sort of like Texas with 5 states in one. West Tennessee is very agricultural. Our family were not farmers, but we were surrounded by it. And that was useful because it gave me a sense, like if you want to crop in the spring, you have to plant in the fall. You don't keep pulling the thing up to see how the roots are doing and all that sort of thing. I was an only child, and so, all of the stuff that comes along with that. Parents were older when I was born. I think my dad was 38, if I remember correctly. And so, that had its own impact. Both of them were children of the Depression. World War II. Dad was a POW in World War II, captured at the Battle of Anzio. And a little side observation, Michael, for whatever it's worth, there were 16 million men and women in uniform during World War II, mostly men at that point.
Yes.
And I think, I'm no historian, but I really think a lot of the impact that we have seen since World War II came from taking a whole generation of male influence out, not just for 4 years. When Dad came home, he physically came home, but he left a part of his soul on that battlefield, and that was true of a whole generation. I did not really learn his story until he was in his late 70s. He just didn't talk about it. And as he got truly older, the facade began to crack. And he told me stories of his early life and experiences in the POW camp and things after that really... There's a book by, let's see, is it Bradshaw? I can't remember for sure the author, but the idea being that if there are things that the family doesn't talk about, the children somehow know anyway, and they go ahead and act it out. Whereas if the family is open about the family skeleton, Uncle Robert, who's the alcoholic, that kind of thing, then they don't. And without getting too pop psychology here, I could see where I had problems in relationships that almost exactly mirrored the stuff that Dad told me about from 30, 40 years prior in his life that I knew nothing about, but I was repeating it anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work. When I say great, like meaningful and scientifically rigorous around transgenerational trauma. And how these stories from our elders, from our ancestors, come into future generations, whether we choose to talk about them or not. There's I believe, a Disney or a Pixar movie, and there's a song called We Don't Talk About Bruno, right? So we, like I forget the name of the movie at this moment in time, but it's that whole concept like, hey, we don't talk about Bruno in our family. Like, there's a lot that families don't talk about. And in this country where we sit in the United States, there's a lot dating back to the origin of this country that we choose not to talk about. And the pain is still there, and it breaks us apart, or it doesn't provide the right type of environment for us to come back together, to heal, to get connected, because we keep on denying the fact that it happened. The fact that we don't want to talk about Bruno doesn't mean Bruno doesn't exist. Bruno exists. Mm-hmm. And we keep on rippling in a not so pleasant way, rippling our trauma, our hurt into future generations because we don't want to talk about some of these things because they hurt. And we don't know how to talk about them because in a lot of ways we were never taught how to.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to me that it's not just that it will hurt, but that you will wind up doing the same thing. The kids will, or the grandkids.
Yeah, history repeats.
Yeah. Talk about it, process it. And as you say, we were never taught. It wasn't neglect because, Dad was 100% supportive and loving. He just didn't talk much. There is an Arlo and Janice cartoon that I have kept a clip of from years ago where he talks about his dad, was I don't know if he was a World War II veteran or Korea, but something like that. And he's talking about how the sitcoms of the 1950s would make dads to be out like affable fools.
Yes.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking about it now, it's obvious that it's from World War II because it says they tried to do that, but they couldn't pull it off. They had licked Hitler, and then it's got a panel that shows his dad sitting in the dark, eyes wide open, smoking a cigarette, drinking coffee, haunted by what he remembered. And, of course, it's a comic strip, but it's such an impactful little strip. And what it said was they couldn't pull it off, so they had to leave it to others to actually be fools. And the picture in the fourth panel is Arlo from my generation back in the 70s with the bell bottoms and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I've never served, but I've been able to talk to many who have. And, it's things that you cannot unsee, that you can't forget. It's trauma in its purest form. It's big trauma. And if we don't come back and talk about it and process it, it just stays with us. And I think that's the difference between today and, say, World War II or the Vietnam generation when there was a draft. Now, only a certain part of the population goes off to war, right? Because there's no draft, that we can be isolated. There's a privilege in that. So we don't have to really face that type of trauma. But we went through that as a planet, as a country. It's still with us today, even as you mentioned, even going through the Depression, I know for my wife's grandparents, they went through the Depression as adults. And, a lot of their behaviors through the rest of their lives, they lived to 99 and 95. They were married 74 years. It's a great story.
Wow.
But even as a 92-year-old, some of that behavior was a result of things they learned growing up through the Depression. And so that was traumatic. So this whole notion, this is one of the reasons why, I wanted to come back out with the podcast. Here, the reality is that we chip and we crack and we break as humans. So we can say that we have times where we're broken. And that doesn't make us less than, it just makes us human. Because I know in the internet out there, it's popular to say, hey, you're not broken, which I think what people are trying to say is you're still worthy, you're still whole and valuable, and you're not defective.
Mm-hmm. I think as a culture, we tend, when things are broken, we tend to throw them away.
We tend to throw them away, and because, hey, today we buy cheap stuff and it breaks, and it's like it costs more money to fix it than it is to replace it. So we just order something new from Amazon. And so with Kintsugi, it's about acknowledging that we break, we crack, we chip, because life is complicated. It's messy, it's muddy, and there's trauma that we live through, that our elders have lived through, and we can find a way to heal. We can find a way to connect. And we come into a different type of beauty, a beauty that embraces our imperfection, that sees our scars as these beautiful symbols of our strength. And so as you grew up, you had that. You had the cracks from your dad came into you.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And in support of the theme of the importance of connection, when Dad was a little older, he joined an organization. It's still in existence, although its members are slowly dying off, called American XPOWs.
Oh,
And he
yes.
took me with him to their dinners a couple of times. They would meet at a buffet restaurant.
Ponderosa or Sizzler.
That sort of thing. Yeah, this was in Jackson, Tennessee at Casey Jones Village. All you can eat. And boy, those guys could eat. And I noticed when he got among people who could understand his experience, he opened up, he would talk, they would talk. It's just a busy room, which usually these guys were just silent. One of the things I noticed, Michael, was at the end of a meal, you look around the room, there was not a scrap of food left anywhere. They did not waste anything. But when Dad was able to connect with people who understood, he not only opened up, but he processed. It was only after that that he was able to talk with me about what he had gone through.
Wow. That's powerful, Donn. Thanks for sharing. Even that little tidbit about cleaning your plate. I grew up in a household, and I don't necessarily know where it comes from because my mom has passed and my dad is 87. I don't know if it comes from their childhood, but to this day, I'm 56 now, I cannot leave the table without my plate being cleared. Like I know sometimes it's important to stop, like when I feel satiated, but there is something powerful within me, from my childhood, maybe from my parents' childhood, because their parents came through the Depression. Like whatever we're served, we're going to eat, because you're not really sure where your next meal is going to come from. So in this, raising of you as a child in Western Tennessee, and thanks for that. I didn't realize Tennessee was like 3 different states. I just thought it was like this very flat, skinny thing.
Well, and West Tennessee itself is very flat, literally. It's all river bottom. Middle Tennessee around Nashville is a plateau, mostly. Technically, it's a basin.
Yeah, and it gets a little hilly in Eastern Tennessee.
East Tennessee is where we're getting into the Smoky Mountains. And so...
yeah, the Appalachian Trail and the Blue Ridge Mountains and all that good stuff.
When I moved over here, Dad asked me, he said, well, because, we grew up in an agricultural area. And so Dad said, well, what do they raise over there? I said, well, mostly rocks.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hey, someone's got to raise some rocks.
Yeah.
So here you are, you're in Eastern Tennessee, you're with this wonderful woman you met online through back in the day. You're a parent of a child of a daughter that has some special needs. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about your experience as a parent, because, being a parent, even when our kids are healthy, that is a tough gig. There are plenty of books written about how to be the best parent, and from back in the day, Dr. Spock to, contemporary authors today, but it sure is heck not easy. And I know a lot of parents, I'll put myself in this camp, you have moments where you're like, I don't think I'm doing this right. Like, am I doing this right? Am I breaking my kid? Like, am I downloading my pain onto them? And you hope for the best. You work, hopefully, your butt off to try to provide for them, but it's still a really hard thing to do. And that's when our kids are healthy. And I can only imagine that it just gets exponentially more difficult if your child doesn't have the type of health that you want for him or her or them.
It does indeed. Quick context for the parenting thing. Janet and I have a blended family. Both of us had been married before. So I had 3 kids from a previous marriage. She had 1 kid from a previous marriage. And then Hannah, our disabled child, is ours together. There is a 14-year gap between her and the next youngest child. And every once in a while, we'll go somewhere and they'll say, oh, it's so nice that the grandparents are taking care of this child. Okay. And then when we tell them, no, she's ours, then they look at us a little funny. And I've learned to say, no, she was planned. This is not a once more for old time's sake.
We're young.
Yes, younger. Well, maybe not. Anyway, so the 3 from my previous marriage, our oldest son passed away about 6 years ago. In fact, come early January, it will be 6 years.
Sorry for your loss there.
And thank you. Thank you. He was severely diabetic, like his mother. His mother, late ex-wife, is how I refer to her. She passed away in 2011. There's been a lot of trauma, but I will also put this into quick context. In my pastoral work, I learned that people will use pastors as sort of a cheap therapist.
Yes, I imagine, yes.
Which is fine, okay. But I noticed a pattern that there would be somebody in my office that if you saw him on the street, you would think, not a care in the world. And he pours out this story that is so intensely challenging that you're saying, how is it you're not in a fetal position on the floor? And then he leaves and the next person comes in and they've got a story like that. And then the next person. And after a while, I realized that everybody faces circumstances that you think, how in the world can you deal with that? But we don't talk about those things. And so in the first place, we think we're the only ones. And in the second place, that just makes it that much harder to deal with because we're not talking about it. I don't talk about this much in the college classrooms, Michael, because they're mostly young. And I don't want to make them nervous, but my observation is everybody at some point in their life, if it hasn't happened to you yet, just wait. And I say that chuckling. It's not, I don't guess, inevitable, but we're surrounded by people who have dealt with that sort of thing. And the flip side of that is that humans in general, see, we hear a lot of times people will say, you're special people. No, we're not. Our circumstances may be different than somebody else's, but everybody faces that kind of thing that makes you think, how in the world am I going to deal with this? And you do. I think humans in general are far more resilient. And so people will say, well, I don't know that I could handle this. Well, I don't want you to have to handle it, but if and when you face it, I'm pretty sure that you will. You yourself are a great example of resilience. And I think that's more of a human trait than what we realize because we don't talk about these things.
No, we don't. And to your point, we're all going through something. Maybe not all at the same time, but I can appreciate how you don't want to scare the college students in letting them know that doom will come your way or something challenging will come your way.
And for a lot of them, it already has. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of them that have faced amazing stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amazing stuff. Things happen. The only real predictable part of life is that the unpredictable will happen. And to your overall point, I agree. I think we're incredibly resilient. It's born into us, and we can enhance our ability to be resilient. We can make that muscle stronger, but it's a muscle that we are born with because we can get through a lot. And look at the last 5 years. We've gotten through a ton and have proven that we can do hard things. And that's just part of who we are as creatures. Like any creature, the ant to the dog to the elephant, we as living creatures, I think we're resilient. We want to push forward. We want to live. We try to find a way through.
That's been one of the great values to me of the Pause, Breathe, Reflect community. I mean, quite seriously, to remind ourselves together of this. I often say that Hannah, our disabled daughter, is our greatest teacher. Again, for quick context, she has a very rare chromosomal disorder. There's only 15 to 20 like her known in the world at any given time, according to the medical literature. So we're just lucky. People sometimes say, how do you deal with the lack of certainty? Because with only 15 to 20 like her known in the world, reason you know what to expect from measles is because millions of people have had it, so you can build a medical database. Hers is a chromosomal disorder, and it involves something that's called mosaicism, which means that it's not in all of her body cells. It's just in some of them. And so even among those 15 to 20, each one is unique because the mix of damaged cells will be different. So there is no predictability. We don't know if she will be with us for another 6 months or another 80 years. And so people will say, well, how do you deal with that? And our response has been, nobody knows really what's going to happen with their kids. We live with the illusion of predictability and certainty. They're going to go to school at a certain age. They'll graduate. They'll go to college. They'll get married. We think we know what's going to happen. And so we have been literally disillusioned. I don't know that comfortable is the right word for it, but we've gotten used to the idea of make your plans, but hold them lightly because they're going to change. And Miss Hannah has a lot of veto power over our plans.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's plan tight, hang loose. And what I hear in what you just shared, Donn, is acceptance, that we accept, we may not like it, but we accept that life is uncertain for us and for everyone else. When you shared, just my situation, my whole family was like, oh, he's going away for another business trip. He'll certainly come home just like he's come home each and every time before this one. And then I almost didn't. And so that was our first experience with the unexpected comes to your door, like Rumi and the guest house, like, welcome all visitors, when they show up and laugh, because you never know what to expect. So thanks for sharing that in, your journey with Hannah, because I think that's through you as a parent, it can also help you stay present because like what you have right now is this moment and you don't know what's going to come in the next moment. So let's just try to be here in this one and put as much love and attention and intention into this moment because right now that's all we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming up, Donn and I discuss his relationship with depression and writing, his ikigai, and his current book, as well as his upcoming one. All right, let's take a break. Take a full breath in and a slow releasing breath out. And relax the body as you soak up our conversation. I hope that felt good. Okay, now that we're a little bit more relaxed, can we be real? I think our morning routines, well, they've gotten a little out of control. You might not have time in the morning to meditate because you're busy doing other things like trying to get to work or getting the kids off to school. And this is where my app, Pause, Breathe, Reflect, comes in because I built it for busy people with a whole bunch of shorter practices. So if you don't have 10 minutes in the morning to meditate, cool beans. You're human after all. But I bet you have 5 times throughout the day when you have 2 minutes to practice and let go of stress and bring mindfulness to your everyday moments. So today, download Pause, Breathe, Reflect for free and begin to stress less, sleep better, and join a community of like-hearted humans rippling something worth rippling into the world. All right, let's go back to our conversation and celebrate the Kintsugi within us all. So let's talk about writing. So you referenced this earlier. So your third book, which is now your second book, you're editing, which means that there's a first book. But the interesting thing about your journey with a writer, because you're a professional speaker as well, but just the whole notion of there was a period of time when you weren't writing, that you were going through your own struggle. And I was hoping you can share a little more of that background with folks. And then I'd love to get into the first book, and then maybe we can talk about what a reader should anticipate in the second book.
Okay. And Hannah figures into this unavoidably.
Cool.
So it's weird to me, by the way, Michael, that I can think in terms of 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, So back in the day, before Hannah came along, I was making progress as a professional speaker. This was in the 90s, so it was before one of the recessions that kind of remade the speaking industry. And then 9/11 came along, which completely remade the speaking industry again.
Yes, it did, yeah.
And then the 2008 financial crisis remade the speaking industry again.
Yep.
And then the pandemic, so, I mean, it's been a challenging industry all along, but back in the 90s, I was making progress. And then mostly when Hannah came along, I became undependable in what was the standard model back then. I think you were speaking professionally in that time as well, so listeners may not know that back then companies would contract with you to speak at least 6 months, more commonly a year ahead of time. And I found myself in situations. Hannah was hospitalized 36 times in her first 4 years of life. No, I'm sorry, not 36 times, 24 times.
Still a big number, Don. 24,
right.
36. Like, we're not going to quibble.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
24 times in her and sometimes for long periods of time. Her longest stay during those 4 years was 58 days at once. So I found myself, having to call the company up and say, I know we contracted for me to be there, but my daughter, we don't know if she's going to live. I can't come right now. Left them scrambling to fill a slot at the last minute. I could not, in good conscience, market myself under those conditions. And so pretty much lost all that progress. And I tried to keep the writing going. I started a newspaper when I was 14 years old. So I have made some or at times all of my writing.
How about that?
Yeah. Can't do that these days, labor regulations and all that sort of thing. But it was a real boon to me at the time. And so I've made part or sometimes all of my living with writing since then. When the speaking became undependable, the internet was coming along, and that was changing the writing industry. So I couldn't make full-time money with that. At least, I can't say I couldn't. I will say that the relationship I was in at the time, this was early days, we needed something more dependable.
Sure.
Something that had insurance and all that kind of thing. Again, I have to say I have loved teaching all these years, but it was not my first choice. If I had been just a bachelor or whatever, I'd have taken the chance of going hungry. Couldn't do that to my family. So the period when I was not able to write came along after Hannah's issues became more clearly manifest. It wasn't clear when she was born that she was going to have these issues. It took a while to be able to tell her special configuration, so to speak. And so I was exhausted. Those first 4 years, we had 100% of her care. Without getting into the politics of it, we could not qualify for the... I'm going to trot down a side path just a little bit here, Michael.
Yeah, sure. Go for it. Yeah.
You have car insurance, right?
Yep, we do.
How often do you want to use it?
Never.
Right. Okay, same thing for fire insurance, just all...
For really all insurance.
Except we have this thing we call health insurance.
Yes.
And we want it to pay for every aspirin that we take. That's not insurance. That's a third party. And you put somebody else in the middle, of course they're going to take their cut.
Absolutely.
A side effect of this is we do not have health insurance. We have no way of insuring against catastrophe. We were older parents when Hannah was born, and had there been something like true insurance available, we would have taken out a policy. Wasn't available. And so the commercial insurance would not pay for her care because commercial insurance is set up for acute problems.
Ah, yes.
And on paper, we made too much money to qualify for Medicaid. So there was no cushion. There was no safety net. And we took care of her ourselves while I tried to maintain a full-time job. I have to say my college was very patient with me, but I was exhausted. My wife is also partially disabled, so she couldn't take part in her care. She finally qualified for Medicaid at age 4 because she spent those 58 days in the hospital. And so technically the hospital became her residence.
Oh, wow.
And therefore our income didn't affect it, and she got the Medicaid.
That's a lot.
So I was very glad to have that, but at that point I was exhausted, and I would try to write. I would try to read. I've always loved reading, but I would read for 6-7 minutes and fall asleep. Meditation was very difficult during this time, Michael, because, I'd just fall asleep because I was always sleep deprived. So to make a longer story shorter, I went for about 10 years there where I said, I can't write. I'm too exhausted. I'm too depressed. And I was dealing with depression. I still deal with depression as a clinical kind of thing. Last February, I was having a conversation with a fellow member of a group that I'm in. In fact, it's the guy that I met just this morning. It was our first time meeting in person, but, we've known each other 2-3 years now.
So cool.
He is a writer also, and mostly what he does is writing with other people, co-authoring. And so he had said, I'm looking for some ideas, and I had pitched him an idea. And he said, I don't think that's for me, but he said, you should write that. I don't know if I can do that or not, Jeff. I've been 10 years. No, you should. Okay, what the heck? I'll give it a shot. Writing is one of those things that changed a lot in the last few years because the gatekeepers have come down. Independent publishing is viable, respectable. And I thought, okay, I'm going to check into it. And I started writing, and I kept writing. And kept writing, and I realized that my depression was lifting. Now, I don't want to suggest that all anybody has to do to overcome depression is to write. I'll say in a minute why I think it made a difference to me. But my mistake had been I thought I wasn't writing because I was depressed, and in my case, the truth was I was depressed because I wasn't writing. And here's where I think it may be more generally applicable. It's not that everybody who's dealing with depression needs to write. If you are dealing with clinical depression, you absolutely need to talk with professionals. But I think there's a lot of what people will feel like is depression, and what it is they're not honoring that which makes their heart sing, whatever that might be. If what you really want to be is a creative plumber, solving those problems, and plumbing can be a huge problem. If you get your satisfaction from that, that's your best way to avoid the kind of depression that I was dealing with. Now, I still go through my blue periods like everybody does. I had the last couple of days, in fact, I was struggling with that. But I got out last night, pulled out, I can't even think what the name of the program is that I use, Scrivener. Scrivener is what I use for writing. So I pulled out the manuscript I'm working on right now and did some editing on a couple of chapters and realized I feel a lot better. I'm honoring what it is that makes my heart sing.
I love that notion. What comes up for me too, Donn, as you're sharing is the Japanese have a term called the ikigai. You might have heard about it.
Which is in this book, by the way.
All right, cool. We'll get to it. But that whole sense of there's a reason to wake up in the morning. Call it purpose, call it mission. And your writing, in a large part, is part of your ikigai. And it's also part, when we look at our kintsugi and the urishi, the lacquer that, helps us heal, that puts the pottery back together, it also can be found there as well. And everyone's urishi is different and everyone's ikigai is different. But what you're sharing is it's in that spirit, like what makes your heart sing, what turns your pilot light on. You can have a whole bunch of different analogies and metaphors, but what wakes you up? What energizes you? And to find that. And when that is missing in our lives, life can get really dark and depressive and sad and heavy. And that's when we can break apart. You also can feel lonely. What I also hear from your story is your ability to stay in community, to have people around you, even if it's virtual, that there's some strength a sense of belonging and maybe a sense of safety in a community of like-heartedness, to know that whatever you happen to be going through, you're not the only one going through this. Everyone's going through something, as we've talked about. But that form of connection also helps you to keep going, even when you have, as you mentioned, the last few days, maybe a few blue days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came across the concept of ikigai. I have a real bad sense of time. It's been 2 or 3 years, although I've been fascinated by Japanese concepts ever since high school when I dated the Japanese foreign exchange student. That's what got me started with that.
Well, how about that?
But we didn't talk about ikigai back then.
No, I don't think that would be part of a high school conversation.
Right. But I remember just off the top of my head, it's like, what makes your heart sing? What are you good at? They're not necessarily the same thing there. What the world needs, and how can you make a living? And finding an overlap of those four can be really important. I had been able to do one or two of those things, but finding that overlap made a huge difference. And that's where it worked into the book. The book that's already published is called The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why. And this seems like a natural time to go ahead and talk about that a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit further about what the book's about and what the reader can expect, because it really sort of touches a lot of your own personal story too.
Absolutely. It's not autobiographical, but it is inspired by a lot of stuff.
Inspired by Donn, which is pretty cool.
There we go. Yeah. So the title comes from, we've heard a lot from like Simon Sinek and great concept there about you need to figure out the why before you figure out the what and the how.
Yes.
There is a related concept, and I think this one comes from Japanese culture as well. It's called the 5 whys. And so you ask, well, why do you want to be an insurance salesperson? Well, to make money. Well, why do you want to make money? Well, so I can take care of my family. Well, why do you want to take care of your family? So you go at least 5 deep. Okay. What I had observed, though, was you could go 5 deep and even deeper and still be fairly surface, And this was a speech, actually, to begin with. This was one of my signature speeches. Come back to the speech thing just real quick. One of the things to happen out of the pandemic was all of a sudden I was on a level playing field with every other professional speaker. None of them could travel. I couldn't travel, but I could be dependable on Zoom. So I started speaking again. And the signature speech was The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why. The idea being that you need to ask why the way a 3-year-old does. They're not going to be satisfied with a surface explanation. And so it came up with 5 guidelines, things like look for the story, look for the emotion, look for the so that. We all know the story. Why did the chicken cross the road? Well, to get to the other side. Nobody ever thinks to ask, why did he want to get to the other side? Maybe he's got Colonel Sanders chasing him. Maybe he's got hungry chicks.
Maybe there's a Japanese exchange chicken on the other side of the street.
It could be.
There's a whole bunch of different possibilities. So
Yeah. So, look for the so that. I want to earn good money so that. So that's just an example of one of the values. I could have then just written a book, just a nonfiction book. But one of my big influencers for a long time has been Bob Berg, the co-author of The Go-Giver. This is a genre that is called the business fable or the business parable. And the thing that makes a good business parable is that it's got to be a good story to begin with. Not naming names on this other one, I know of some business parables that it's very clear there's a lesson that we're trying to get across, and we're just going to kind of paint a story on top of it. The characters are wooden, the plot's thin.
Yes.
The thing that makes The Go-Giver such an effective book is that it's a great story. And in the process of that story, then Bob and John David Mann teach the principles of the 5 laws of stratospheric success, I think is what they call it. And so I wanted to tell a good story to help people understand and apply these principles. And I decided, since I had just gone through this thing of figuring out what my core value was, that I could use experiences from that to put together the story of The Way of the 3-Year-Old Why. So the book follows Dan Roberts, who is he's a college professor and a speaker who's been struggling to get his business going, but it keeps getting challenged because he has a disabled daughter. I think you see a pattern here.
Wow, there's similarities.
Exactly.
Picking up on them. I'm slow, Don, but I'm tracking with you. I'm tracking with you on this one.
And I even used a local coffee shop as a setting. But I guess if this were not a business fable, it would probably get labeled as magical realism. I don't want to give away too much just in case somebody's interested in reading the book, but there is a mysterious mentor who appears in the book. She is a barista. And so, I can't think of the name of the book right now. It involved a golfer, and they made a movie out of it with Will Smith.
I don't know. I'm quite bad at remembering things like that.
Yeah. For folks who are listening, I'll look it up and maybe you can put it in the show notes or something. But
we can put it in the show notes. And we'll put the link, obviously, to your book and all the ways that people can find you. I think the whole concept of storytelling, Don, is so important because, hey, this is how we learn. Like when you look at the stories that we sit with today, they're the better ones, right? We sit around the campfire, we sit around the circle, and this is how we learn about life and society. We try to make sense of the world, and having a business fable, I think at this time is so important to really, actually, there's a question I asked recently on LinkedIn, a very unscientific LinkedIn poll that I do from time to time. And I asked people what they most wish for in 2024 from their colleagues in their company. And the number one response, head and shoulders above everything else, is being able to truly focus on what matters. So like getting back to like the whole why. And I love the whole title of the book, too, because I think I read somewhere that the most curious person in the world is a 4-year-old girl. I'm not sure how true that is, but just as a girl dad, I will say I am not discounting that statement. Like I have 2 proof sources in this home, and they would ask me some really tough questions, and they would not let me off the hook. I could not give them a BS parent answer because they would just stay on that nerve until they got an answer that was satisfactory from dear old dad, or they just got tired of me and went to mom.
Yeah. And so in the book, the mentor is guiding him in asking these kind of questions of himself.
I like it.
And see, this is where it's fiction because I didn't have a mentor like that. I kind of wish that I had, but so I don't want to give away too much about who the barista is. There's a little bit of mystery there, a little bit of a reveal. And so, we'll leave it at that. But I did find the movie and book I was trying to remember here. It's The Legend of Bagger Vance.
Oh, yeah. Now I know the title of the movie. I never saw the movie, or if it was based on a book. I never read the book, but I do remember that title.
Yeah. And so, there's a whole genre like this, whether we're talking about movies or books, and like every other genre, there's tropes. Karate Kid, there's another one that's in the same thing, the wise, somewhat cranky mentor, not exactly coming of age, but the growth thing. And we were talking about storytelling. I mean, it's how people have made sense of their experience throughout all of humanity. But there's a basic structure to what makes a story a story. It's not just this happened, then this happened, then this happened. There's a focal character facing a challenge. There's something at stake, something to be lost. In the process of facing that challenge, the focal character changes or grows. And among the ancient Greeks, if the circumstances overcame the hero, it was a tragedy. If the hero overcame the circumstances, it was a comedy. But in any case, there's change, there's growth. And so we see that with these business fables. In fact, sometimes when I read one that I consider not to be a good fable, it's like, there wasn't that much at stake. There's got to be, you think about Star Wars, you think about any movie that we wind up really caring about. Velveteen Rabbit. Yeah, what's at stake?
Yeah, The Hunger Games, The Wizard of Oz. It's all in the spirit of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and that's the arc. Luke Skywalker goes in, gets trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi, finds resistance in Darth Vader. Along comes Yoda. And then the whole movie series unfolds as it does.
Here's a trick question about Star Wars, and this is not a trivia question. I ask my college students this sometimes. It's interesting to see the answers. Who is the focal character for Star Wars? Now, the immediate response usually is Luke Skywalker.
Yes, that's the one that you would tend to hit upon. I, now knowing it's a trick question, could it be Darth Vader?
In fact, it would be Anakin Skywalker, which he became Darth Vader, okay? But
yeah, well, yeah, because there's an unveiling at the end of like what the real truth is, hey, Luke, I'm your father, right? So
yeah,
there's a whole journey of how he was when he was younger, and then how he turned over to the dark side, and then eventually came with the revelation that, here's who I am.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's classic, as you say, it's classic Joseph Campbell. So that's why we relate to those things so much. And that's what I was trying to accomplish with The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why, as far as story, and then use the story to help people remember and understand and apply the principles of, I call them guidelines, for asking those kind of questions of yourself.
Well, in the spirit of Kintsugi, what I hear from you is the power of these questions, these principles, these guidelines. They're lessons in connection of having us come back to our why and really making that connection with oneself, pulling from Ikigai that we've already talked about, but just that understanding of who I am, why am I showing up, which then allows you to connect with others in a meaningful way. And when that happens, when we have connection with a group of people, now we start to put a more powerful ripple into the world.
Absolutely.
So, which is really cool. So we'll get you out on this question. This is the last question I like to ask folks. You probably already know it if you've been listening.
And may I interrupt? I didn't know if you wanted me to mention the current book that is going to be that second book.
Oh, if you want, yeah, if you feel comfortable mentioning what the second book is, I'm going to encourage everyone to buy the first book and then get hooked.
Yeah.
So then you're ready for the second book. So yeah, Donn, please do share away what the second book is all about.
Okay, so the second book that is going to be published was originally planned to be the third book, but it really grabbed a hold of me. It's a story that involves Dan Roberts and his daughter, Hope, who is much more involved in this one. And you might say, how can somebody so profoundly disabled be so involved? One of my other friends in this same group that I was mentioning a little while ago is an intuitive medium.
Oh, wow.
I was listening to a podcast with somebody else who was interviewing a different medium. And I'll tell you honestly, Michael, I'm not sure how much credence to give to such things. And yet I know that folks who are genuinely doing that, not scam artists, that they make a big difference to people. And I knew this woman who was in my group and how she has touched lives. And in listening to that other podcast, there was something that was said. I'm trying to think what it was now. This is not somebody who interacted with the dead so much as people who otherwise couldn't communicate. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if a medium had the ability to communicate with people who were in a coma or people who were, like my daughter, who is completely nonverbal.
Mm.
We've never been able to interact with her. The closest we've ever come, the stereotype is blink once for yes, twice for no. She can't even do that. We could get her at times to, if the answer is yes, blink. And then we would have to ask a question on both sides. Honey, would you like the television turned on? No response. Well, then, would you like us to leave the TV off? Slow blink. That's our yes. If you get no response, it might be it's a no. It might be she's ignoring us because she's a teenager after all. It might be that she's asleep because she sleeps with her eyes open. And so the idea of being able to find somebody who could provide a communication link was intriguing to me. And that gets at that whole importance of connection and communication, which is one of my things. And a story just kind of came to me in the middle of the night. And so I'm tentatively calling the book Medium Well.
Oh, how about that?
And it's about a young woman who gets a job in a children's hospital working as cleaning staff. And this is not much of a spoiler because this comes out in the first chapter, in the first few pages. She goes into Hope Roberts' room. Hope is in the hospital. This is the disabled daughter from The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why. She walks in the room, and Hope is sitting up in bed, and Sky is the protagonist, Sky Jackson. Sky talks with her, and Hope says, "You can see me?" Well, duh. Could you tell the nurse, XYZ, whatever? And so she goes out and gets the nurse. So remember, this is cleaning staff. Goes out and gets the nurse, and the nurse said, "That room? That is Hope Roberts. That girl has never spoken a word. I don't know what you think you heard, but you did not have a conversation with her." And this is setting up throughout the book. Sky has to come to terms with her own abilities, the risk that it puts her at. Well, I'm getting emotional thinking about it now because there's interactions between her and some other children, but hope becomes a recurring theme. And the same mentor that mentors Dan Roberts in The Way of the Three-Year-Old Why winds up mentoring Sky Jackson.
Oh, wow.
So I think this before we started recording, I mentioned that I'm going through an editing right now. There's a lot of stuff I have not read myself in a few months. And as I'm going through it, it's making me cry. A lot of it is because I can relate to what Sky must be going through, and a lot of it is because I wish that I could interact with Hannah the way that Sky does with Hope. There's a reason she's named Hope.
Hope, yes. It sounds like a powerfully emotional story, and I can already tell that it will bring the reader in right off the rip. And so, I can't wait to read that one as well, Donn. And when you share, I can feel the emotion in your voice, and just how it's so relatable to your own story with Hannah, and sharing it in the way that you're going to share. I know it's going to speak to a lot of people who need to hear that story in the second book.
And no pun intended. I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Or pun intended. It's all good. All right. So we'll get you out on this question. This comes from, it's a derivative of a question that James Lipton would ask from the old show Inside the Actors Studio. And it goes like this. So this is my variation of it. So let's assume that when we pass away, you come into heaven, if there's a heaven, if you believe that there's a heaven. And when you go to heaven, you get to meet and reconnect with your ancestors, your elders. So when you reconnect with them, what do you hope they say to you when they first greet you again?
Mm-hmm. That is an impactful question. We'll make some assumptions here. The assumption that people in heaven know what's going on down here.
Yeah, we make that assumption.
Yeah, as we're answering that question. And so it's probably no surprise that the first thing that comes to my mind is my dad. And I would like for him to say, "You did your best. You weren't perfect. You screwed up a lot, but you did your best. I'm proud of you."
That's a great answer. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you for asking.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks for being on and sharing your story, Donn. This was such a treat. I'm so glad we were able to do it. And as I mentioned just a minute or two ago, I'll put in the show notes all the different ways that people can interact with you and follow you online. And of course, get your book. And then they can read that one and anticipate the second one coming. So I really appreciate all that you do. You're a living example of Kintsugi and putting a beautiful ripple into the world. And from my perspective, the world needs more folks like you, your like-heartedness at this moment in time to put that positive ripple into the world, the storytelling, so we can come together and connect and make some positive change happen. So, as bold as this sounds, on behalf of the planet, we thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That means a lot to me. It really does. I was sharing with Jeff just this morning that this group that I've mentioned, I feel a lot of times like imposter syndrome, and I know that's a real quick, easy label to put on, but I'm around Bob Berg, whose books have sold 20 million copies, a Hall of Fame speaker. Jeff was the number one Aflac salesperson and sales manager. He has now written 3 business parables of his own that are award-winning. The CEO of a grocery chain in Puerto Rico. All these people who have achieved so much. And a lot of times I feel like because of choices I've made about family, that I've never come close to reaching my potential. And so when I hear something like what you just shared with me, it really means a lot, and I thank you.
You're welcome. It's legit. So we'll stay connected in our Pause, Breathe, Reflect community and work on putting a beautiful ripple out there into the world. So again, thank you, Donn, for showing up. Don't you just love Donn? I loved when he said, try to find what makes your heart sing. Isn't that beautiful? If memory serves, I believe I met Donn on the social media app called Clubhouse that became pretty popular during the pandemic. Donn popped into one of the meditation rooms I was leading for Pause, Breathe, Reflect. And he's been part of our community ever since. I love his energy and his wisdom, and I hope you did as well. As you might know, we love to do a short meditation, just 2 minutes, based on what our guest shared with us this week. So for this week's meditation, we'll drop in and get curious with ourselves on what makes our heart sing. So if you're ready, settle into a comfortable position. If you like, you can close your eyes. Of course, you can also keep them open. And we'll drop in. We'll begin with a few grounding inhales and slow releasing exhales. Allow yourself to settle into this moment as you reflect on the wisdom Donn shared with you. And when it feels right, settle into the natural rhythm of the breath. And you may wish to place your hands on your heart. And as you look within, feeling this connection with your heart, I invite you to reflect on this question from Donn. What makes your heart sing? When you think about this question, what comes up for you? What makes your heart sing? What makes you feel awake and alive? What is that for you? All right, nice job. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes and wiggle those beautiful fingers and toes, and you might wish to give your body a little stretch. And I'll encourage you to spend some more time reflecting back on this question, or perhaps journaling about it. What makes your heart sing? I want to take another moment to thank Donn for his time, for sharing his story, his creativity, his curiosity, and making a difference in the world. Donn, we appreciate you and the ripple you're putting into the world. Thank you for coming on and truly living the Kintsugi spirit.